Good evening. I'm so pleased and excited to welcome Samuel Bravo and his wife Jessica to the back to the GSD, I should say, and to this celebration of his Wheelwright Fellowship. Since 1935, the Graduate School of Design at Harvard has awarded the annual Arthur W. Wheelwright Traveling Fellowship. I said 1935. It was established in memory of Wheelwright, class of 1887. And importantly, it was intended to encourage the study of architecture outside the United States. When it was founded, Americans, for the most part, did not travel that much. It was a prize clearly thought of as a kind of American version of the Grand Tour, where architects would go to Europe, Greece, maybe Florence Rome, of course, but maybe Florence in a pinch, and that was about it, to become sanctioned by that travel as architects. And it was available only to GSD alums in the Department of Architecture. A few years ago, the GSD was pleased to broaden the scope of the competition by inviting architects practicing anywhere in the world to apply. And in addition, they were to propose research agendas outside their country. That's stipulated in the contract of the grant. They still had to travel outside the country of residence, but an affiliation with the GSD is no longer required. The prize is $100,000, and for a young architect or firm, it can make quite a lot of difference. It's awarded annually to talented early career architects worldwide with a proposal of itineraries for research, discovery, and the development of what really is an ongoing design project. And I say that because in the case of Samuel, who is here tonight to present his Wheelwright 2017 research. Samuel he'd studied in Chile in the Catholic University of Santiago and graduated and already had established a fairly small office, like 2 people, small, no? But the research was well underway. And was already, let's say, his research into community building was already well underway and being verified by architecture involving buildings in towns mostly in northern Chile, which had been damaged and destroyed by the earthquakes. In 2017, Samuel had already designed and built a community building it was a town of 40 people that was completely lost in the earthquake. But the town is located on a river where in an annual parade, is that good enough? Like a carnival type parade, gathers more than 100,000 people from all over the region. And this was Samuel didn't have a lot of work, but this work was of such quality, the design of such quality, and as importantly, the community engagement of such quality that we thought the Wheelwright was in order. The Wheelwright is productive in many, many ways. When Samuel and Jessica visited Cambridge in 2016, a certain number of months later, they, count them, had a child, and she was able to go on the trips. So the Wheelwright is productive in many ways. I'm glad the vacation was successful, as it were. In 2017, as I said, Samuel won the Wheelwright Prize. His proposed project, which you will hear about tonight, was called PROJECTLESS. It explored the relation of architectural practice with non-project-driven traditions and informal environments. And this journey that he'll talk about involved a study of dozens of cases in 7 different countries. Samuel's work has been exhibited in the 2010 and 2012 Chile architecture biennials in Santiago. The latter, the 2012 project, won a jury selection, and it's also been in the Chilean pavilion. My printer ran out, so I didn't get the date. Samuel, welcome.
Well, thanks, Professor Hayes, for such a nice introduction. I traveled to the remote Yaquerana River between Brazil and Peru because I wanted to know the collective dwell of the Matsés people. There, I witnessed the construction of the Chubut Siquecaid, a communal house of the Matsés, in a process that revealed the extraordinary bond of the culture with a territory that they are able to interpret through craft and knowledge and language. Then Abel Bina, a traditional leader, told me, with the construction of this house, gave me great joy because with it I'm going back to being. I was impressed by these words. I wanted to understand what he really meant in the context of deep cultural transformations undergoing in the recent history of the Matsés people. And this insight represented a pivotal moment in my process. I would like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to the jury of 2017 Wheelwright Prize, Gordon Gill, Michael Hayes, Mariana Ibanez, Moisen Mostafavi, and Gia Wolf. Thank you all for your faith in my proposal, and thanks also to the GSD and to the Arthur Wheelwright Traveling Fellowship for such an amazing opportunity. I would like to recognize all the amazing people that in so many different ways collaborated with this endeavor along the way, especially my daughter Eloisa and my partner Jessica, which came along with me and shared this experience in a way that makes it difficult to individualize the origin of our thoughts. I will frame the itinerary of my journey within the guidance of this question about to dwell and being, that in front of each case unfolds in a particular dimension. Upon the relation of Lima with the Andean world, I will analyze the role of community, cooperative organization, and the common ground for thinking about informality. Then, in Belém Bajo, I discover a settlement that reveals a territory and a particular relation with water, with it the fluctuations of the public realm, a condition that resonates in several water settlements observed in other regions. In the case of Bangladesh, I learned from the community architecture method in Jhennaidah. I also learned about the symbiotic and often problematic relation between the formal and the informal city in Korail, Dhaka's biggest slum. And finally, with the construction of the communal house of the Matsés people, I will refer to dwelling and being, and the apparition of the human environment as a synthesis of this relation between language and craft. The South American stage consisted of 3 excursions in which I made short residencies in places of interest, sometimes coming back up to 3 times, such in the case of Lima, and especially in Iquitos, which has a strong seasonal fluctuation. Well, the first step of the journey was the Cerros of Lima, where I explored the informal process of one of the biggest metropolitan areas in South America, and its bonding with a traditional Andean background. The Barriadas movement began in the 50s as the Andean people drawn to the city organized themselves in committees that later gave origin to informally built settlements. This urban process reached up to 70% of Lima's area. Now, what has been remarkable about Lima's case is the ability of the informal process of transforming a piece of desert into a proper city within a matter of decades. And this is both an ongoing process and a massive driver for the built environment. So we wonder, can informality be turned into a positive force for creating the city? And if so, then what is the nature of informality? The Peruvian urban anthropologist José Matos Mar said of the barriada, I dare to propose that the barriada is the great form of accommodation to the capital of the provincial migrant. In that sense, it is not only the answer to a problem of homelessness, but much more than that, it is the other Peru that makes himself present and claims belonging, citizenship, and recognition. Its peculiarity is that it has recreated in its midst the world of the Andean community, that is expressed in the presence of traits such as reciprocity and mutual help in work and social life, Minga Anaini in Quechua, and self-government, Kamachikok, based in the participation of all adults in decisions as it happened in the Aiju. Aiju is the basic social structure of many different Andean peoples. So at the same time, in 1967, Bernard Rudowski stated in the catalog of his famous exhibition, Architecture Without Architects, that we don't have a proper name for a broad portion of the built environment that has been produced in the absence of the architectural project. We extend to it the names of vernacular architecture or traditional architecture, while from the point of view of the method, it might not be architecture at all. This is not a judgment, it's just noting that it relies on different processes that we as architects are not used to. Implicit behind this assertion is the understanding that we as architects are yet to develop new methods and strategies for learning and operating within the projectless paradigm. Although through architectural history, the how do we project has been under scrutiny many times, this questioning rarely reaches the architectural project as the fundamental method of the discipline, and this methodical criticism has the potential to reshape our discipline, as some innovative practices are already doing. I stayed in Coyique, in the northern mountain stretches of Lima. There we gathered testimonies from old settlers as well as young community leaders up in the Cerro. I visited and interviewed the architects of Coordinadora de la Ciudad en Construcción, which have developed a long-term commitment with the neighbors of La Balanza in Comas. I walked through the stairs that climbed to the very end of the newly built houses on the edge of the mountain. With each step, it seemed more unlikely to dwell there, away from the water and access roads. Yet, once you are at the very top, it becomes apparent that one more house could be built. Up in the Cerro, I talked to Mr. Wilder Asipa, a worker carving a small terrace in the rocky slope, just big enough to set a light prefabricated house. The mountains are wrapped in this seemingly infinite pattern that fades into the hazy atmosphere. The need for building a terrace carved in stone in order to settle the slope seems to revisit the substantial relation to the ground brought by the Andean imaginary. Then Mr. Asipa took a bag of coca leaves and a small pot with a stick covering chalk and put it in his mouth to chew. The chalk adds some alkali to help the enzymes of the saliva extracting the alkaloids. This is the traditionally revered Andean consumption of coca. For the Andean people, the slope is a daily and fundamental inhabiting condition where, as in stairway, the unevennesses represent transient situations, while the platforms provide permanence. The agricultural terraces also separate two conditions of the mountain range. Seen in elevation, they are a sterile stone wall. Viewed horizontally from above, they are stratified extensions of fertile land, arranged for the smooth runoff of water. I followed this linking thread up to Andamarca in the Andes, where the Andean agriculture is still sustained by traditional cooperative organization. Behind the cultivation platforms lays an extensive network of canals that bring the water from the Puna, or highlands, and allows irrigation. Without this network, the cultivation terraces would be useless. The channels are one of the largest collective works in the legacy of the ancient Andeans. Their administration and maintenance is due to a traditional cooperative organization, perhaps the most relevant network of cooperation that remains to these days. Edgar Guamanica is just over 30 years old, and he's the major of irrigation of a canal. As a traditional authority, his job is to manage irrigation and maintain, along with neighbors, the nearly 20 kilometers that the canal has. Now the irrigation network greatly contributes to create a territorial routing of culture. It is the Apus, the patron mountains of the highlands, which provides the water. Farther west, there is the arid littoral desert. The Andeans live in this fertile stratum where the water can be carried from the mountains, and the mountain itself can be terraced to nurture the wealth and variety of the Andean agriculture. The potato and the corn, the quinoa, and many different tubers. This territory is in itself complete. It is systemic, it is generous, it is wise and meaningful. So I volunteered for the restitution work of a funnel of this fallen irrigation canal. The canal had collapsed on an abrupt slope, exposing a bedrock that made it difficult to build again. We started with a group of neighbors with pikes, chisels, and pikes. And after a long climb to the Puna, near 4,000 meters above the sea level, where the air is thin, we enter a canyon to find the canal. To begin with the work, Edgar, the water major, offered coca leaves and gave a bottle of rum with a glass that began circulating between the lively debate in Quechua. Each one took the glass, dipped his fingers, and dripped towards the Apus, the patron spirits of the mountain that provide the water. Then dropped some trickles to the ground as a payment to the Pachamama, and then finally drank themselves. At the end of the talk, the eldest asked me in Spanish, "Samuel, what would you do?" This dialogue offers an insight in the way an essential construction takes place within a community. We know how ideas develop within the project paradigm, but should there be no project, then how do ideas develop, are shared, and get built within informality? A short answer may be by talking, but let's try an experiment. Take the case of a canal. A groove in the ground made so that it can transport water through distances. Its slope should always descend, however moderately, so that the water loses the least altitude along the way. This essential definition has no shape or material, although water on the ground needs to be mentioned. It contains in it all the conditions that the construction must satisfy. In a way, it is the most condensed instance of a project, but it lacks all the specificity, as it lacks design. Design is the process of giving shape to ideas, specifically by drawing. This way of thinking synthesizes an intention into a spatial formulation. We participate in this essence of the build as an emanation of dwelling. In this way, it also instaurates a common ground to our understanding of the environment. It can be designed, but if the design fades, the idea of the canal persists. It can be built, but when the material falls apart, the canal still remains among us. I think Professor Hayes better explained this with the example of a pyramid and the Kantian idea of a scheme. But as we came from Lima, one thing should be asked. When did the community of thinking and making a shared environment started to get lost? Architect Eleazar Cuadros explains that today the challenge of the barriadas is to a great extent a conflict of public space subtracted from the community and being consumed by particular interests. Such is the case of land traffickers. In the past, informal settlements were community-organized invasions. They had something heroic about them. They're even consolidated in the Peruvian Constitution. Today, land traffickers claim for themselves the right to lot and sell the cerro. They would maybe invest in an access road and a stairway, sometimes even a soccer field, but then they will manage their debt portfolio in a mafia scheme. Some of them achieve political momentum out of their role urbanizing. This is how there is often a degree of complicity among authorities and land trafficking. Eleazar Cuadros and Javier Vera from Coordinadora de la Ciudad en Construcción began working years ago with a community dining room held by a women's organization in La Balanza, Comas. Through his cooperation, they found a way of articulating community and collective space. They also involved local authorities in the process of consolidating collective spaces from the pressure of alienating interests. And you may also remember their work over La Balanza community dining, because it was already here a year ago in Ana with Jhennaida's presentation. So informality, much like a mirage, fades as we approach. Informality is a formal consequence of dwelling and a product of culture. It has typological constraint. It is developed as a place appropriation strategy and an attempt of context adequacy. Despite the difficulties and distortions it is undergoing, the Barriadas movement did conquest the desert and managed to create the city out of it, something that is yet to be achieved over the fluctuating grounds of Belén Bajo in the Amazon. This is a place where the earth can turn into water and the water may become earth. During the growing season, the neighbors travel in canoes and temporary pedestrian walkways. This is the way the people have organized their lives around the cycles of the river, the coming and going of the waters. What does it mean to dwell the temporality of water? I will take the neighborhood of Belén Bajo as a paradigmatic case which incorporates a multiplicity of dimensions observed elsewhere. Belén Bajo is nuanced, it is complex and contested. It can split yourself between awe and rejection. It is located in the city of Iquitos over the seasonal flood area of the Italia River. The neighborhood is composed of tall structure of palafitos and houses that float in the fluctuating waters. Belén Bajo is under the influence of the largest river in the world, the Amazon, which until 1980 flanked the southern margin of Iquitos. The Amazon does not have a definite course and leaves at its wake a landscape in constant transformation. Its meanders crawl through the territory, cutting the ground, devouring kilometers, and leaving lengthy lagoons behind. Year by year and season by season, and the rivers change. Today the Amazon has retired, but Belén Bajo remained its domain. Now, when the dry season comes, the river withdraws and Belén Bajo experiences an extraordinary transformation. The ground emerges as a clear and shady space between the palafitos. The breeze runs through the stilts, refreshing the humid heat of the summer. The children gather under the houses, and an entire ground level makes the town a great hypostyle hall. The town can be crossed in multiple directions, with relative independence of the streets. The space under the houses provides a place to stay and gather around with neighbors, and the street is celebrated. Belén Bajo is the home of merchants, fishermen, and farmers in the great market of Belén, the main market in the city of Iquitos, and a sort of interface with the broader region of Iquitos. Most of the products that the city of Iquitos consumes comes through the market of Belén Bajo. Now, most of Belén market is a street market. However, a major portion of it is not temporary. It is a definitive transformation of the streets into a market. And when the river goes down, the market extends to until the river. But in Belén Bajo, most people do not have access to drinking water, and sewage is directly discharged into open water courses. And even having a latrine in a creek or at the outskirts of the town is an advantage that many people lack. Each year, the neighbors set up a network of runways that allow partial connectivity, however precarious. It is an example of collaboration. Once the water is gone, most of this effort has to be dismantled, as it occupies the vital space of the streets. Now, urban life is based on spaces and services that are largely absent in Belén Bajo. We must ask ourselves why we don't find here most advantages that arise from the life in the city, Why there are no public spaces? Why are there no walkways? Why are there so many people without drinking water and sewage? Why the authorities and the neighbors themselves, creators of an extraordinary space, failed integrating it into a city? For these reasons, some of the neighbors are hopeful with the possibility of being transferred to a resettlement known as the new city of Belén, a housing project some 15 kilometers away from Iquitos. Lito Guayaga and his family are among the settlers that look for better conditions in this governmental project. However, the promises have not been met, and much of the initial project have proved short of accomplishment. The work had been stopped for a year now. Some neighbors are reluctant to abandon what they have achieved in Belén Bajo and the network of relations that their lives rely on. So at this point, we ask, couldn't it be made different? Isn't there any place that has solved what Belén Bajo has failed to solve? And this is how I got to Afua. The city of Afua in the mouth of the Amazon is a city entirely built over tidal flooded ground. Each 4 hours, the tides of the sea come up the river and flood the ground. The highest tides, a few times a year, even flood the street level of the town. During the hot hours of the day, the activity withdraws from the streets of Afua. It is the coolness of the afternoon what brings the neighbors back to the streets. People take out their chairs and gather in terraces in front of their houses. An entire town becomes a family atmosphere. Afua is also unique because the people agreed to ban motor transportation, allowing only pedestrians and bicycles over the runway-like streets. Among all the differences that there may be, I think what propitiates the radical difference between Belén Bajo and Afua is the role of an active city planning authority that literally bridges the gap of public space, provides basic services, connectivity, and even social spaces. Unlike Afua, the merchant communities of the Mekong Delta pose a most radical case of water temporality. There, all what creates the urban structure is absent, and everything that in a city is fixed in a place, here can be moved. They consist of an arrangement of boats and the families and communities that live in the river. These families have in their boats much of what creates the sense of a place and quotidian space, from small gardens on top of the boats to altars and miniature shrines placed on the ship's bow. These boats navigate the extensive network of canals in the region of the Mekong Delta to reach the villages where specific products are cultivated. This is what they bring back to the bigger city, and once there, they mostly source local land market and also sometimes final customers. If we look at this boat cluster, we will see that although all of the boats seems to be able to navigate, the ones in the extremes are most likely used for transporting products, while the ships in the middle are habitation. In the end, what these settlements are made of is a series of movements through the territory and a network of relations. The community is a link to a territorial system of trade and production, and the observing of any informal settlement is in the end the observing of life itself. So again, what does it mean to dwell the temporality of water? This seems to be an unsolved definition, and probably there's no need for defining it. It seems that these places can never be, but they're always becoming something different. While in English, to be, as an ontological definition, is in a way mixed with the transitory situations that involve being, there are other languages like Spanish in which this duality sets apart the essential being from its becoming and its circumstances. The nature of dwelling is a temporary one. In it, the ideal being seems always mediated by the passage of material and temporary manifestations. In Bangladesh, I found in a brick factory an instance of the infinite cycle of the built environment. While some of the workers were assembling the kiln with raw bricks, right next to them on the other side of the wheel, Another group were dismantling the fire bricks. Informal environments, much like this kiln, are never finished, but rather ever-evolving processes. I went to Bangladesh as a part of an eastbound journey from the west of India to the Mekong Delta. In Korail, Dhaka's biggest slum, I observed the symbiotic and often problematic relation of the formal and the informal city. Korail is located in the Banani Lake, an artificial lagoon created as a landscaping element for a 1950s urban development. The relation of the informal neighborhood of Korail in Dhaka is at once symbiotic and contradictory, because the city benefits of areas like these sourcing services, as you cannot have a service city without people, and the people, on the other hand, benefits from a central location and working opportunities. What keeps Korail then from becoming a prosperous area, and if not solving the problems that arise out of encroachment, at least working on them side by side, the civic organizations and the local government authorities? Korail is a complex settlement. It has in it an entire urban system with education, a market, and a commercial street, worshipping, and services. It even has a dairy farm with cows in the middle. Tansil Shafiq, an architect and researcher, points, the biggest fear that these people have is that one day you will see thousands of police coming and evicting them. The one major drag for Korail developments is land ownership. If the people has no access or participation of any of the different available models of ownership, then the settlement is illegitimate. And for a government-owned plot of land, this becomes a matter of political will. This arises the ghost of mass eviction. As an opposite to this, I went to Jhennaidah to meet Kondaker Hasibul Kabir and his office, Co-Creation Architects, whose main work strategy relies on people's shared ability for creating the built environment. The community architecture method focuses on developing capacities within communities. As a first step, the neighbors are invited to observe themselves, analyze their environs, and gather their own spatial information. This part of the work is called community profiling. When facing a problem, the neighbors are encouraged to design themselves and are assisted in this process. While building the projects, they receive the fundamentals of project management, so they can autonomously carry the process. And finally, when a new community approaches attracted by the results, they are referred to a previous formed community to guide them through. In this way, the process and abilities can disseminate in an autonomous way, a process that in many ways resembles tradition as a knowledge transference method. Community architects do not necessarily show up when there is something to build. They question the built environment and make the people question theirs. They promote community organization and self-awareness. In the end, the built environment is seen as an expression of the life of a community. It is a consequence of the people's capacity, their awareness on the community and on themselves. People is the origin of the built environment and not the other way around. And a primeval expression of this community in relation with an environment is what I went looking for into the remote Amazonian hamlet of Puerto Alegre. The community of Puerto Alegre is the last in the upper part of the Yaquerana River on the border between Brazil and Peru. The Matsés people came into sustained contact with the outer world in 1969, and the life in the communal houses was maintained until the year 1999. Since then, the role of community and the life and the defense of ancestral lands came into a complex restructuration of new relations, leadership, and aspirations. The communal house, Shubut Sigekait, plays an important role as a built instance of the community. In the 70s, the Chilean architect and video art pioneer Juan Downey traveled with his family, his wife Marilis Downey, and Titi La Madrid, the 12-year-old daughter of Marilis Downey, to the Yanomami communities of Bichasi and Tayeri in Venezuela. He carried some of the first video equipment, bulky and primitive, but his intention was beyond registration. He wanted the Yanomami to interact in real time with the image they were projecting. The Yanomami saw a monitor for the first time, and within it, magically, their own image. But Downey did more than that. He described the Maloca of the Yanomami, the Shabono, as a light and invisible architecture that embodied the material and significant relationship of the Yanomami with their surroundings, a link to the cosmos, to the ancestors, and part of the same jungle in which they belong. This registry is at the same time burned the reality that it registers, contributed to pollute and dissolve it into another culture. The Yanomami immediately understood that the Shabono was no longer the center of their universe, but it was a tiny part of the most remote periphery of a world in which they would never fit. As we enter into the Matsés territory, an extraordinary landscape unfolds around, with ancient forests of vibrant nature. Before dawn, the trees around sparkle with firelight. All kinds of birds passed by, toucans, macaws, herons of different kinds. Some occasional rainstorm and a forest of an inexhaustible wealth of forms, palm trees of a dozen different types, immense lupuna trees with a whole world living in their canopy and with thick vines hanging from their branches. This side of the river is Brazil, and the west shore is Peru. Both sides of the border, indigenous lands are protected, however, they are threatened. After noon, we stopped at the house of Mr. Arturo Tumi, an old matsés who decided to get away from the matsés hamlets, to live alone with his family in a place where he could still hunt and fish. His house on a hill is surrounded by huge trees. The farm is a magical space, practically a yucca forest, so high that one can walk below. There is also corn, cocona, and wild tobacco to chew according to the matsés custom. Next to the house, there is a small maloca or shubut sikekait, a house with a roof that falls to the ground. There is something nostalgic about the story of an old man who leaves the village to live like before the missionaries arrived and the order of the matsés world shifted. Here in the distance, he has been able to reconstruct part of that order. In times before the contact, the Maloca was also the center of the Matsés universe. It was the only place in the world where they could actually be, due to the hostility with neighboring tribes and with external visitors, such as rubber collectors, loggers, hunters, and even the Peruvian army. The Maloca was the place of family, the place of friends, and the articulator of a community in the territory. It bears in itself meaningful relations and materials that tie it as a part of a nature that has been interpreted and humanized. There I met Abel Vina, a man that, like few, incorporates the recent history of his people. Abel's house is a large and gloomy room with high palm roof blackened by smoke. The walls and floor are made of pona, an open palm tree trunk splintered in slats that is used as a board without the need of a sawmill. The result is a space punctured by thousands of light slits. Beams of light fell from the ceiling through the fireplace smoke. 3 hammocks hang, and Abel rests on one of them. Abel told me that the community had decided to move their Maloca to a new location outside the village, and that he would move to live in. I was thrilled by this news. It means that I was being able to document and witness all the stages in the construction process. In 1999, the great communal house of Buenas Lomas Antigua fell, and Abel decided to found a new community called Puerto Alegre in the remote Yaquerana. The old people were dying, and with them, the communal life was extinguished. Later, Abel told me, without the Shubut Sikekait, I cannot mean anything. That is why we have built it, to represent ourselves as matsés. The construction of this house gave me great joy because with it, I'm going back to being. The connection of dwelling and being never appeared to me in a clearer expression. Chuikid, the matsés word for boss, means someone who frequently advises, tells stories, and is consulted. Rómulo Neca, referred to in Spanish as El Sabio, or the Wise, was our master builder. He would guide the construction. Rómulo acquired this craft by helping his father. The Shubutsike Kait is an oral building. During the construction, the Wise gives the instructions. He directs and teaches how to do. Otherwise, the Baloka is a system of parameters. Once the width and length are defined, there are no more decisions. The rest are building craft and a typological consequence. Much of the work consisted in collecting from the surrounding the precise materials, a work that required to identify the right species and the right quality. 2 species of palm leaves were used for the roof, 3 cambium bark and vines for tying different parts had to be brought from hours away. I can only imagine what this task would have been without metal tools. By means of orality, the Maloka interprets the role of nature in the context of the human and of the belonging of the human in the natural environment. The forest is the substratum for this dwell, which appropriates all what there is experienced, touched, and transformed, known and named. The word for shelter and house, shubu, comes from a kind of palm that is used for shelters and roofing. It can be hand-picked with no need to chop trees or using metal tools. So it is possible that this leaf was used as an early construction materials. Besides, it is also found in some other languages of the Pano-linguistic family, like the Shipibo. Shubu then extends to other shelters in nature. It is used for wasp nest, Marinen shubu, and Cheman shubu for the yellow rampant cacique bird nest. Earlier, we did an experiment about the persistence of abstract ideas, but abstract ideas themselves tell too little about the basket woven with leaves. They tell too little about the elaborate craft the matsés have developed to woven a cloak-like palm roof. Without the craft, the material awareness of thinking hands, it just wouldn't be possible to translate the essence of an idea into matter. We note here that the word object comes from the Latin objectum, which means to throw in front in a sense of displaying something. Similarly as in project, which means to throw forward. Crafts are here the process that makes possible to materialize an idea in front of people. So the word object always supposes the presence of an observer, of a human. The word for access opening, shekwe, also means burrow, and the word ushte, the sleeping place, is the same as the word for nest. The word for hammock is also taken from the kind of palm that provides the fibers it is made of. The juncture of the roof slope at the end of the Maloka is called scorpion chest due to its particular woven pattern. In the Matsés language, many meanings come from nature to the human dwell, and then, as the nests of the Paukar bird, go back to nature. This is how the human environment emanates from nature, by meaning and interpreting. The Maloka has a timeless darkness. Even during the day, it seems permanently buried in the night, a burrow. The day, at its openings, penetrates with a blinding force. Upon entering it, it is not possible to distinguish people. After a while in the interior begins to appear. In the dim light, the palm leaves acquire certain brightness. Even blackened by smoke, its texture appears as a metallic reflection of the entrances. The Maloka is also the place of fire. In its clear center, community meetings were held. The side aisles were served to hang the hammocks, and in separate spaces, the fires of family kitchens. Trunks are located at the ends as a seat to receive and serve visitors who will not enter beyond the triangular space at the end. The Maloka has a particular warmth. In it, the words fade smoothly. At the end of this work, the community gathered to celebrate. We had a typical matsés meal with cooked banana, fish, and chapo, a non-alcoholic banana beverage. There was an instant of dialogue in which each of the men present had a say regarding the significance of the word, the current times, and the condition of traditional culture, and remarkably, the conservation of the lands and ecosystem. I choose this picture because I think it is in a way a comment on change and adaptation. You see, someone brought a laptop and people gather around to watch a movie. The community gets together and instantly recycles the darkness of the Maloca as a cinema. So being in the house hamlet, Chubut Sikekait, is to take a particular place of the matsés within nature, amidst the extended family and surrounded by what it is transcendent in life. I think this is what Abel Vina wanted to tell me. Thank you.
So we just take some little time to talk and then. So Samuel and I will just take a little time to begin a conversation that you will quickly interrupt us, please. I was fascinated, of course, with this idea of an Andean imaginary, and I wanted to begin there because my larger question is going to be a polite challenge to the word informality, which we also use, and I think it's I think it's the word that we've decided to use for such projects as you show, but the idea of an Andean imaginary, as you were talking about it, I was jotting down things that I thought might be the forms of the Andean imaginary might include certain forms. And of course, the terracing that you showed, I mean, it absolutely seems profound to me, the way, it's a very particular way of inscribing the earth, of marking the earth. And I understand it has functional derivation or in like tectonic derivation, but when it goes into the imaginary, the schema, thank you, it goes in as form. And I was looking at other things, even the stones that when you were talking about on your little trip where they were building a canal, the stones seem very, very specific there. The size, the way they're scattered. I mean, I know that happens in many places, but the photographs you took made them look very precise and very to that locale. And I was thinking that there should be a way to map or draw or schematize the form of even of the stone, because how it lays on the earth also informs how you then build with it, how you gather it up. And then the last was the canal itself, and I didn't quite did you stay for the building of the canal?
Yes.
Yeah. Because you didn't quite answer how the dissemination of knowledge or dissemination of technique does take. But you mentioned maybe they talk, you mentioned they don't draw. But those three things, the terraces, the stones, the canal, made me think that in the Andean imaginary there are forms of, like forms of building, but also forms of collaboration, forms of communication, that is to say there are certain forms. It's not truly, it may be informal, but it's not unformal. And I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that.
Well, they took a long time at the beginning, and they were having a really nice time together. I can tell. And this was the anthropologist José Matos Mar, kind of an instance of self-government. They all had a say about what to do, and then when they finally agree on how to approach the work, then they proceeded to execute the work. But then they also needed me to have a say because I was present, and I think according to their tradition, I should have said something too. Of course, I was of not much help, but but I think it is important that they consider me, and I think it's this talking what makes possible. I think that this schema and this image belongs into the realm of the language as a way of thinking. So this talking is what makes it possible to get shared.
You know, and then the extraordinary. I can't see the name of the communal house that the matsés built. How is it again?
Shubu Tsikekait, but let's just call it Shubu.
Okay, let's just refer to it without calling it anything. It's an extraordinary construction. And did you find could you detect that there were also, still these forms of collaboration? I mean, I know that some of this stuff almost comes over time. The tradition becomes so strong that it's almost without thought, or it's just like what we call muscle memory, or it's just part of it's part of the imaginary, very precisely. But did you detect some? How are these techniques handed down? Do children expected to somehow apprentice or follow their parents around to learn weaving and tying and the tectonic connections, and does it scale? Is this only the architecture of the communal house, or do these techniques scale down to domestic dwellings?
Well, it does scale, and I think to a great extent that allows for the preservation of part of the craft that are involved in the weaving of the roofing, right? And then every part of the maloca has a particular name, so the typology is precisely configured. Like there could not be a missing part, and there could not be something that is not considered within this typology. And I guess that leads us to the notion of Alberti's beauty of that is something is a community sensation, communis sensus.
May we ask a few questions?
Yeah, absolutely. But let me ask one more, and then I'll stop. Just one short one, because I know. I admit that when I first saw this building, that I thought it was your project, because Samuel, in his characteristic modesty, didn't show any of his projects. But I just wanted you, maybe, and then I will stop. Is there a brief? Probably there's no brief way of saying. Give an example of something that you have learned. Your own work had already learned from similar situations. Did you gain new knowledge that can actually be not that this is the necessarily desired end, but could it be employed?
Well, I was thinking about understanding some things that I had already applied in other projects, like why it has to be like woven the leaf. I had used different kind of palm leaf in other projects, and this is the first time that I have seen this like so precisely woven, and it has to do with the drying of the leaf, that when it gets dry it shrinks and then the water can go through. Mm-hmm. But if it is precisely woven, you begin to understand this sort of subtle perception of the materials. Like when the matsés tie together structural parts of the construction, they use a kind of vine, but then when they tie together the scaffoldings, they use another kind that is much more flexible and comes actually from the cambium of the bark of the trees. So it's amazing. It's a lot of subtle elements and a precise, very precise knowledge of the environment.
There was a question.
Oh, I just wondered when I looked at that image, which I can barely see now. Well, I just had a question. When I looked at that image, first of all, I wondered a little bit more about the people. Now, when I see that image, I think the men are sitting on one side and the women are in a corner.
You're right.
So how do the women see the screen, I wondered. And then I wondered how many people are in this community or in this extended family?
Well,
so if you could tell us a little bit more about the people and the community, and what do these men do when they're not weaving, so forth and so on. Who wove this? Was a lot of it done by the women, or by the women and the men, or what?
Well, this is a difficult issue. I actually wasn't planning to refer to this because I think it's quite controversial, but when you approach to a community like this that has been contacted by missionaries, and then you realize that an entire world shift and that get lost, you immediately tend to reject that, right? That is why in vast areas where there are still uncontacted tribes, missionaries are forbidden. But here it is hard for me to condemn this process, because you see that the role of the women in the matsés society has improved dramatically with the contact. There are stories about the women being kidnapped, like when there was fight among different tribes. The women were taken and the men were all killed. And up to these days, there are still women that speak different languages that come from different tribes, some of them with no surviving men. So it is it's a very difficult reality. And in the old times, the women used to sit behind the men in the social instances. And if the men feel that the woman was being too gentle to other men or something, he could easily beat the woman. And this kind of violence against the woman is something that the matsés now have abolished. So it is in a way a very good thing and a significant improvement in the status of the woman. But they're still very separate in the roles that they take. The women perform some certain jobs, and the men performed different kind of jobs. And I guess they probably wasn't paying much attention to the screen because they were just not interested in the movie. But there are a lot of things that make a severe distinction in the role of women and men in traditional societies. And this is something that we could discuss, but I don't have much more information about it.
Here.
Yeah. Oh,
okay. Thank you for this wonderful lecture, Mr. Samuel. So I want to return to the topic of informality that Professor Hayes raised before, because most of the literature talk about informality as processes that are outside the economic process of construction. But obviously here there are different processes that formalize what we are seeing here. So I wonder if you could find, or you found, even hidden rules that formalize the process of construction. This is, I see this image, and I know the process of Chabono because I'm from Venezuela, and there are many, many rules, sometimes hidden rules that formalize the process. So I would like to know if you detect in the construction of this Shubu or in the Chabono or in the amazing path that comes out during the winter, comes out during the winter, if you found hidden rules that are repeated, that we can determine as a type of formalization of the process of the construction process.
Well, I think the Chubut Sikekaid is an entire set of rules. Rather than some hidden rules, it is completely a system. So when you see, for instance, the two columns that are right beside the entrance, this has an anthropometric measure, and it's a man with their hands open. So it is quite like the Vitruvian man in a way, to see a matsés doing this in the entrance of the construction. But yes, you think when you set the right dimensions of the construction that you're making, then the roof is going to have a certain slope, and that has to be preserved. And then there's a precise way of joining together the two main water slopes of the roof, and so on. Like it is a system of relations.
First, thank you for sharing that great part of your trip with us. It's very interesting. And I guess my question or comments follow up to the previous one. You talk about how, like in India, there's a co-creation architecture, and that what they do is expression of the life of community. I guess, in short, I'm thinking, is it possible for the architecture we have today that utilize a lot of machines and is so embedded in the hierarchy of the system of how the authorities and all the bureaucracy works? Is it possible to do architecture for the community? I'm asking because the example you showed, one of the one that how the local people construct a house, there is a lot of local, I'll say, the knowledge of man that's like human or like hands involved. It seems like, but now what we do, we are making everything super calibrated, like super precise, because we are relying heavily on machine, and we're sort of detaching us or our hands from the construction of architecture. But I'm just wondering, is it still possible to create things as expression of community in our today's setting?
Well, that's a difficult question. Of course, there are a lot of things that keep us that keep ordinary people from getting involved in construction. Even in the case that you mentioned that was in Jhennaidah in Bangladesh, co-creation architects, the final construction work were made by specialized workers, and the people was involved in designing, in thinking, and in managing the process. And if some of them knew how to work or needed a job, then they could also join the workers. But of course, there's certain standards that need to be met in modern construction, and this is an obstacle for the common people to get involved in construction. But other than that, the case of Jhennaidah has the degree of public policy. The work of co-creation architects involves directly the local authorities and the local government. So, same as in the case of Coordinadora de la Ciudad en Construcción in La Balanza. They could probably do what they do without the authorities, but they understand that it is important to get the authorities involved in the consolidation of public space. I don't know if I'm addressing your question.
We'll take a couple more.
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk, also a very beautiful talk in terms of your photographs. I have a question, I guess. So I think Michael tried to get you to talk about how this influenced or tied into your own work. Some of the other questions have been more about how this ties into processes or sort of, let's say, lessons learned in terms of production and standardization or form. My question would be, how do you tie this into a sort of disciplinary context? You referenced Rudovsky from 50 years ago, 52 years ago now, and how would you say that your experience of having gone to these communities and documented so well these informal environments offers a different reading today now, maybe partly in response to your question of we're in a very different moment of production, but how do you deal with Rudovsky having done this 50 years ago and now you're doing it?
Well, I think probably not the entire answer to it, but a key to that question could be thinking about architecture as an ethnography. If you think of architecture as a series of hypotheses about reality and about life, then the verification of those hypotheses needs to come from the contact with the people that is experiencing the architecture. And we have a certain thinking of the architecture in a way of a project, of a reality that is finished and that is untouched. And I guess a key to that is to think about how do we experience these buildings. How do we register architecture not as a still image, not as a finished product, but rather as an evolving reality that is created by the people that lives there. So I guess we have to be able to recover all this experience into the project and hopefully also into the process.
Andrew.
Just like to echo Sarah's appreciation of the beauty of the presentation. I think the photographs were quite striking, and I'd like to use them maybe as an occasion for a question about representation. So Michael used the word drawing, or one could draw some of the phenomena that you saw in the field, and yet I'm struck that there were almost no drawings in the presentation. There was the kind of section of the communal house that was a kind of proper drawing, and then maybe a kind of diagram of a canal. The others, I'd say, are more maps. Everything else was photography. And even in the case of the photographs, there was a kind of striking difference between yours and the one photograph you showed of Downey's, in that I would describe yours as a kind of immediate form of witnessing. Like, this is what was in front of me. In Downey's case, it was almost like a David Hockney Joiner, where there's a kind of an attempt to recreate the spatiality of the thing he's observing through the sort of stitching of the photographs. And so I'm wondering if there's a kind of ideology that you're attempting to sort of softly convey to us that has to do with representation, that in fact it's drawing or representation more generally that is exactly the kind of enemy or barrier that would prevent us from achieving a kind of more direct relationship between architecture and the kinds of collectivity that it might sponsor. That it's this sort of distancing layer of abstraction that we might get away from through other means.
Yeah, well, through some experiences that I have had working with communities, I have tried to make, well, I do a lot of plans actually, but then when you get to build the thing, you have to explain the building to some group of workers, and then you may not need any plan at all. You may need some measures, and then you may need a system of relations that they can interpret and they can understand. And this has to do with the way of working that the matsés apply in their own work. But about representation and about photography, yes, I think it has and there's also the interviews, and there's also a lot of video that I'm not showing here but much of the research that I did was recorded in video, like dozens of interviews, and that I think contributes to create a body of documentation for an ethnography. And as for the photographs themselves, I have seen a lot of kind of idyllic versions of reality, make-up reality. I didn't want to persuade anybody in the pictures to look in a different way than the way I look at them spontaneously.
Last question, I'm afraid, sorry.
Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. I would love to push you a little bit further to talk more about your work, of your architecture. I don't know if you have any images, but I'm really interested in how you walk us through these beautiful traditions that are not just about construction, but community building. And I'm wondering about some of the big lessons learned or takeaways from your presentation, which are in large part related to sustainability of materials or availability of materials, cooperative labor, ritual, and dialogical processes. And I'm just wondering how to move from taking these beautiful examples that come out of traditions that are handed down from generation to generation to a practice that is perhaps pushing us to think in different ways, in a new way. So it's sort of like taking the traditions that may be unfamiliar to us, and what are the lessons learned that can be then adapted to a new way of thinking about architecture. And if you can if you could tell us more specifically, I don't know if you have any images about instances. And then small connection to that is if in your practice, in following these methods, does that create more participation in the buildings themselves, right? So if following some of these lessons that you've learned from these traditions, are the buildings then generating other processes or making the users participate in different ways? So the question's about traditions into a new era for architecture, but also if you have found that the users' behaviors are somehow molded by these same processes.
Well, first of all, I will try to refer to the adaptation of tradition into our practices. I'm not willing to promote a revival of a sort of traditional look by any means. I think that what creates what we understand as heritage and as tradition and as vernacular architecture are logics that are embedded into construction. And these logics can be abstracted and interpreted into newer materials. As in the case of the place where I live is an island in southern Chile. We have these old wooden shingles that are not being used anymore. And people complain, why people don't use any more wooden shingles? Well, because there are no more trees, because they are much more expensive, because they resist in a much worse way the weather. So the new vernacular architecture is composed actually of metal sheets, and everything looks like metal sheets, and this is our vernacular architecture, and this is what we have to be able to interpret as in our contemporary practice. And the knowledge is there. It might not look like it looked before, but the logics are the same. And the other question, I'm sorry.
Well, and I'm thinking about some of the big takeaways in terms of collaborative labor and, well, of course, in rituals, right? And if involving the community in those, both the labor and the rituals around the production, if that somehow guides and modifies the uses of those spaces in your experience.
Well, it depends on the place where you are. People have their own ritual practices around construction, and And I remember building in Tarapacá, the project that Michael mentioned earlier. It was important for the people in Tarapacá to make a proper opening with a ceremony, but that has been not the case in most of the projects that I have been involved. But there are other things, like the participation of community, like you said, that needs to be taken in account. And sometimes you will also find some opposition to what you're trying to do. The community will not always be 100% receptive for ideas that may tend to recover their own heritage in a way, or reinterpret their own heritage. They may want to have a newer or a different aspiration as they see in the cities or as they see in external models. And this is also, in a way, a valid process. We have to learn to deal with this also, I guess.
Samuel, it was a beautiful presentation. Your language also is very beautiful. I love the title, The Emergence of Dwell, and you said two things. Michelle and I can't remember, we were whispering at the very beginning of you quoted someone about something about being was the last word, and then the other one I loved is to dwell the temporality of water. There's some very beautiful moments, and we appreciate it, and thank you. You can find Samuel's work online, including a really interesting interview with Archinet. So thank you.